Welcome back to Impact. Well, it has been in the works for more than a decade. Issues to do with state financing of political parties in Jamaica and also campaign finance reforms. Well, the first piece of proposed legislation is in the Parliament and it has sparked enormous debate. Today, we have anti-corruption activist and executive director of the National Integrity Action, the NIA, Professor Trevor Munroe, to make the case for the reforms. Welcome to Impact, Professor. First of all, what's the case for state financing of political party financing?
In basic terms, Cliff, there's no democracy in Jamaica, no democracy in the world, where the political party, however much we may distrust them, however much we may distrust the politician, is without a political party. No democracy can survive without a party. And hence the party is a vital institution, no longer primarily a private voluntary organization, but a public body which gives rise to whoever sits in the parliament and ultimately gives rise to whoever sits in the cabinet. And the cabinet is the principal instrument of policy that determines how much taxes you and I pay, how much is put to health, how much is put to spraying mosquitoes, how much is put to national security, and every single aspect of public life. Road repairs, water supplies. So here we have an equation. Party gives birth to the parliament gives birth to the cabinet is a public entity that impacts the life of each and every one of us. Hence, the first issue is that the party can no longer be a private club because it exercises indirect public power. And hence the question of how is it to be funded? Is it to be funded by members' dues? Is it to be funded by fundraising efforts? Is it to be funded by big business? Is it to be funded by criminal money? Or is it to be funded by taxpayers' money, in the same way that any other essential institution to democratic governance, national security, hospitals, clinics, have to be funded?
Or a combination of those?
Or a combination. And I think once we understand that point, and then we go further, to recognize that for many different reasons, there is no country in the world where the political party in the 21st century is funded primarily by members' dues, for good reason. A poll was done in 2013. 107 different countries, 114,000 respondents, published in March last year. And the majority of the respondents in the majority of countries felt that the political party was among the least trusted institutions and the most prone to corruption. Now, as a result of that, what we have had since the 1990s in most countries is a decline of membership and a decline in support by membership dues. In the UK, for example, the British Labour Party's income is 11% from members' dues. Sweden, it's 3%. We don't know what it is in Jamaica because parties are not registered. We don't know what their accounts are saying in terms of sources of income. And that's one of the points that this bill is intended to achieve. So parties become registered.
So what operates now? Tell us how are political parties funded in Jamaica now?
We simply don't know. We can speculate. The reason why we don't know is because unlike NIA, which is a non-governmental organization or registered charity, we have to put our audited financial statements and accounts in the public domain for anybody to inspect.
Yes.
When the parties do that, it is out of their voluntary wish.
Yes.
So that we know from public statements following on the last elections, from both the treasurers and our general secretaries of the PNP and the JLP, that they spent between them, the party center, not the constituents, 1 billion Jamaican dollars. I think the JLP said they spent 600 and odd and the PNP 300 and odd. Whereas I know where Obama got most of his money from by just going on the computer and clicking on the Federal Elections Commission. I know where Mitt Romney got his money from. I don't know where that $1 billion came from, nor do the members of the party. So this is not just a question of the public. But what the bill is saying is, as of now, you need to become registered, you need to have your financial statements audited, they need to be published to the members, and they need to be available to the public, including sources of income.
But part of this story that the people of Jamaica need to know, yeah, is that big business, wealthy individuals finance these political parties on a basis that we don't know who gives how much and to whom. And also, many of the contractors who get government contracts also are expected to give back something to the party, central. Isn't that so?
Absolutely, Chris. And I tell you this, it's hard to find the evidence. When I was doing my doctoral work, and I was in London, I had the opportunity to meet with some of the principals in Tate and Lyle, then, prior to independence, the biggest landowners in Jamaica. At a time when the question of land reform for the small farmers and the peasantry was a major issue. What they told me is that they gave to both political parties. Now, maybe they did it out of the goodness of their heart, or maybe they expected that by so doing, they would insulate themselves by buying influence and not have the issue of land reform become a government policy just before independence. Fast forward 50-odd years. Turks and Caicos Islands, Supreme Court, the confiscation order is being heard. Documentary evidence is put into the court that David Smith, convicted of financial crimes and money laundering, subsequent to his stay in Jamaica, where he was never tried, is saying that he gave $5 million to the Jamaica Labour Party prior to the 2007 elections, $2 million to the People's National Party prior to the election. So that at least is court-based documentary evidence, which has not been contradicted successfully or credibly by either party. So here we have, not at the time a convicted criminal, but at that point, the Financial Services Commission had issued a cease and desist order against Smith. And it is subsequent to that that the court order suggests that he made those big donations. So there is some documentary evidence. If you want to speculate in an informed way, as you were doing a moment ago, when you get a situation where a country is starved of revenue, as we are, and you go on the Ministry of Finance's website, and you see over a number of years, since this 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, some years, $5 billion in tax waivers to non-charitable institutions. I'm not talking about food for the poor. And you ask yourself, when you look down the list, clearly some are justified. But when you look on some of the companies and the entities on that list of persons getting tax waivers, you have to ask yourselves, what is the justification?
They paid for it.
You said it. And that's what we need to get rid of. And that's what the political registration of political parties, where they now have to give their source of income, combined with the companion legislation of campaign finance, it's intended to begin to close that loophole.
Just spend a moment or two explaining the difference between the requirements for registration and financing of political party activities versus campaign finances.
The current bill, which is going to be debated again next Tuesday in the Parliament, is for political party registration and party funding. And what that says is that any of us Jamaicans, we can, if we get sufficient number of signatures and we fulfill the requirements of the constitution of the party, we can register a political party. The party, when fulfilling other criteria, is then eligible to get funding for its operational expenses. That is, officers maintaining an office and so on and so forth. And that's to be equally divided amongst registered political parties. That is very different from campaign financing, which has to do with financing of election campaigns. And that bill, I'm hoping and urging, that the minister and the authorities bring that before the parliament very soon, because it's a companion piece of legislation. That's the bill, campaign finance, that's going to identify impermissible donors, including organizations like OLINT or Cash Plus would fall within that context. It would outlaw foreign entities. In other islands in the Caribbean, the Taiwanese, for example, give money to political parties in order to make them, when they become government, support their policy of to China in the United Nations. So that will be outlawed under the campaign finance legislation. Disclosure requirements. The parties would have to give monthly reporting to the Electoral Commission of who is giving how much. And if a donation is above $1 million, it has to be publicly disclosed to you and I.
So if it's below $1 million, you don't need to publish?
You don't need to publish. You publish to this Electoral Commission. And part of the reason for that is that the ECJ did quite a bit of polling with Don Anderson's Market Research Services. And they discovered that while people were in favor of disclosure, while people were in favor of a cap on how much a party can spend and how much money it can receive, they were not in favor of the names and data relating to each and every one giving to a political party because of Jamaica's history of political victimization.
Right. We're talking state financing of political parties. Later, campaign finance reform legislation coming with Executive Director of National Integrity Action, Professor Trevor Munroe. Stay with us. Welcome back to Impact. We're looking at the issue of state financing of political parties, registering of political parties to establish greater transparency and improving the governance in the country. It's being opposed in some quarters. One of the campaigners for this for the past decade is the Executive Director of National Integrity Action, the NIA, Professor Trevor Munroe. Professor Munroe, the MP for Southwest St. Catherine, the JLP's Everald Warmington, is on record as being strongly opposed to this piece of legislation, saying that it is a burden on taxpayers, poor people, to ask them to finance the political activities of his party and others, and that he's wanting it to be known that he would like a division, a divide in the House, so that he can recuse himself from such obligations. And he wants poor people to know who have voted for this, to impose this burden on them. And it sounds like a popular argument.
Exactly, Cliff. I think you put your finger on it. One of the challenges that Jamaica has faced since independence is that we often go for the popular rather than that which is appropriate, rather than that which will carry our country forward. And Everald's argument sounds very, very popular. And in fact, in 2010, he lived up to his word and he voted against the report then, as it was, of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica for political party registrations. He voted against it then, and I'd expect him to vote against it. No, but let us bear in mind that the convention that has allowed Jamaica to move away from the precipice into which we were looking in 1979-80, almost worst case electoral administration in the world, to what is now best case in many respects. The convention is that argue when the report comes to Parliament from the ECJ, which by the way has representation of both parties, debate, even vote against. But the convention has been that the government does not use its majority to amend or reject a bill or report coming from the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. So while I'd expect everyone will call for a divide and vote against it, I'd be very surprised if this government were to tear up that convention and in any form or fashion reject the bill that has arisen out of 10 years of discussion on both sides of the House. Now let's take his argument. One of the things that poor people, to whomever refers, and you and I, one of the things we should ask ourselves is why there are so many people who are poor in Jamaica. Is this not the result of public policy, in part, the same public policy which has made so few people very rich? So that Jamaica, believe it or not, is now that country in the Western Hemisphere which has the widest income gap according to the figures put out by the IMF in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, the question follows, if it is public policy arising from political parties who form cabinets by virtue of the parliamentarians of who they elect, that has resulted in so many folks being as poor as they are, do we not have an interest as poor people in ensuring that it is not only the wealthy, the big business, as you referred earlier on, the big contractors, who are the ones who pay the piper
Calls the tune.
and therefore call the tune? Mm-hmm. We have an interest in getting involved in the funding of political parties. And since we are 30% young people unemployed, tens of thousands of others not looking for a job, they've given up, we don't have the individual capability to match what the very wealthy and big business are doing, which is their right to give and their right, and they exercise that right. Therefore, the way forward is for a modicum of state funding, of all taxes being put into that issue. Now, if that were it by itself, then it wouldn't achieve much, because all that would happen is that the party would take the state funding and still get big business money to the nth power.
Yes.
But this is where the campaign finance legislation kicks in. Because what that legislation says, and I do urge the government to bring it forward very quickly, is that there's a cap on how much a party can spend in an election.
Oh.
There is a cap. You can't, it's not a jamboree of who can spend the most. So there's a cap proposed of 15 million Jamaican dollars per constituency.
Per constituency?
Yeah. So that if you multiply that by 63, I think you come up with 940 odd million, which is close to what it was in 2011.
Yes.
And not only is there a cap on what can be spent, but there's a cap on what any individual can contribute to a candidate. That's 10% of 15 million, 1.5, or to the party as a whole, and that comes out at 40 odd million. So what we're seeing here is the funding of the party for operational purposes, and the campaign financing now would be attributed on the basis of a reimbursement. If you get 5% of the vote or more, there's a formula to reimburse, and a cap is put on how much you can spend in the elections. In that way, you begin to level the playing field and not have what we have now, is that who can attract the biggest money gets a big advantage over those who can't.
So how did they arrive at these figures? For example, 15 million per candidate per constituency.
They elect the ROPA that you referred to earlier on, the Representation of the People Act, has always had a cap on the maximum spending that a candidate may make per constituency. It has had to be revised. It was $3 million a few years ago, which is clearly out of the question now. So I guess by using the inflation, what they have done is adjusted that expenditure cap to come up with 15 million. Some people feel it's too high, others feel it's too low. But that's a number that can be adjusted in keeping with the times over the years. And it's therefore very important that that cap be there, so that no individual, I mean, right now, Cliff, a businessman or a criminal for that matter, by simply buying, like you go in a car mart and you buy 6 cars, if you give enough money, you can see the kind of influence that he or she could exercise by a candidate or by a section of the party leadership. That is going to be far more difficult once we get the party registration, the accounts and financial statements audited, the sources of income in those accounts declared to the Electoral Commission, and they have the possibility of flagging it if anything looks fishy. And then when you combine that now with the cap on spending and the cap on contributions.
How are they going to effectively administer this regime?
Excellent question, because as you know, we have many good laws in Jamaica, but not enough law enforcement. The campaign finance proposal, which is now being drafted, I understand, into a bill, as was previously approved by the Parliament, has a requirement that the Electoral Commission has forensic auditors. It has a section dealing with looking at party finances, scrutinizing it to ensure that the books are as they ought to be. And where there is found to be fraud, or falsehood, then there are severe penalties. The idea is that there will be a great collaboration between the Electoral Commission, the tax authorities, the Parliament Integrity of Members Commission,
so
and
we'll
the
have to
other
beef up the personnel at the ECJ.
Beef it up. But I think that we're getting now, I mean, 2/3 of the countries in the world, for the reason that we have discussed, have direct funding of political parties.
Professor Trevor Munroe, thank you very much
Thank you,
for being with us on Impact.
And thank you.